Okay, maybe some of you by now have had time to watch, I don't know, maybe the first 2 or 3 episodes of this Netflix docuseries on the 1990s Cowboys, America's team, the gambler and his Cowboys. Those teams, to me, were the most controversial and fascinating teams in sports history, and I do not exaggerate. It's all there, a feast for your eyes in this documentary. It's riveting. It's utterly binge-worthy. I dare say it could go down as a masterpiece in storytelling, docu-making. I wrote 3 books on that dynasty's rise and its fall. And I do appear frequently in this doc. So, and by the way, I apologize again for how bad I look. Lighting was terrible for all of us who got interviewed. But now allow me to provide some story behind the stories told in just the first 3 episodes. The documentary does not make this point, which I drove home in my first book called God's Coach, which came out in 1990. I've mentioned this. I'm going to drive it home deeper now. Just think about this. The only reason that the former owner, Bum Bright, chose Jerry Jones was because Jerry was the only one of, there were 5 or 6 bidders, big time, deep-pocketed bidders. Jerry was the only one of those bidders for the team at that point in '89 who was going to fire Tom Landry. Jerry made it clear, while everybody else said, oh, we're going onward and upward with God's coach, Tom Landry. Jerry said, no, I'm going to let Coach Landry go and obviously bring in Jimmy Johnson. I got this straight from Bum Bright. He was a quirky little oddball of a man with a gray flat top and black glasses. I kind of liked him, but he got a real kick out of this hoot of a guy in Jerry Jones. So all the other bidders were offering far more, trust me, far more than Jerry's $140 million, which is now, as you look back, the all-time bargain for any sports team in history. But Bum Bright had come to despise Tom Landry, who just cold-shouldered him, wouldn't even small talk with Bum Bright at Christmas parties. And Jerry was just adamant from day one that he was bringing in his good friend Jimmy Johnson to coach the Cowboys, even though, trust me on this, Jimmy did not consider Jerry a good friend at all. They had roomed together on the road as teammates at Arkansas only because rooms were assigned by alphabetical order. Johnson, Jones roomed together on the road that one year. So please, Cowboy Nation, sit back and think of the monumental irony of what happened in 1989. The only reason Jerry Jones was allowed to buy the Dallas Cowboys was because he was bringing in a coach he would eventually refer to as that motherfucker. And I quote Jerry on that because you'll hear and see him say that in this documentary. That motherfucker. That's what it came to between Jimmy and Jerry. That motherfucker. What? It boggles the mind. Only in America, or only on America's team. Okay? Now, here's the truth about Jimmy Johnson, who's called an asshole in this documentary by several players. And I was around him a lot. And yeah, I think at heart, Jimmy's an asshole. He can be a lovable asshole. He was a media and ultimately a fan favorite, a media darling, because he's a great con artist with the people that he needs to con. Really great at conning people around him to get what he needs and wants. And obviously, he rose in popularity because he was sort of contrasted, paired off with and against a Jerry who's the biggest, easiest target in the history of sports. I mean, Jerry always put his foot in his mouth and did the wrong thing at the wrong time and made Jimmy look much greater than Jimmy actually was, because trust me on this, I'm about to show you why. Jimmy Johnson did not have a great football mind. Jimmy Johnson was no Bill Walsh. Heck, he wasn't even close to Tom Landry when it came to football mind. Knowing what worked, which players could actually play. Now, Jimmy was, as I've said millions of times, an all-time great motivator by fear, an all-time great culture creator or recreator in the case of coming into Dallas in 1989. No coach I was ever around, and I was around a bunch of them, was better at creating a force field out of which championships sprang. That was Jimmy's forte, his gift, his superpower. So think about this. Here's something nobody knows, especially Michael Irvin. When Jimmy first took the Cowboys job, he wanted to trade Michael Irvin, a receiver Jimmy had won with, obviously, at the University of Miami. Jimmy's point right away was that Michael can't run, not certainly to NFL wide receiver standards. And yet Jimmy was asked by other staffers who told me this to please sleep on it. And Jimmy the next day heaved a sigh and wisely decided not to trade the player who became the leader of 3 Super Bowl championship teams and the greatest receiver to me as a receiver leader in NFL history. The greatest receiver leader in NFL history. Okay, so that's Michael Irvin. Now, what about Troy Aikman? The other stunner to me that didn't get enough attention was that it took Jimmy Johnson really 3 years to believe in Troy Aikman. Now, that point is made in the documentary, but maybe not with the exclamation points it deserved. Jimmy and his coaching staff were split. They went back and forth over whether to take, remember the offensive tackle, Tony Mandrich out of Michigan State? Tony Mandrich, who became an all-time draft bust after going 2nd overall to Green Bay. Cowboys went back and forth. Jimmy's staff went back and forth. Jimmy orchestrating, obviously, overseeing. Back and forth, back and forth. Troy Aikman, Tony Mandrich. Imagine if Jimmy and company had taken Mandrich over Aikman. Just imagine. Yet remember, here's the punchline to this. Even after they did take Troy Aikman, way to go, Jimmy still wasn't quite sold enough on Troy Aikman to keep himself from, in what used to be called the supplemental draft, which came a couple of months later. In the supplemental, Jimmy took his old University of Miami quarterback, Steve Walsh, number 1 overall, because they also had the number 1 overall pick, the Cowboys did, coming off 3-13 and Landry's last year, but in the supplemental. What? When I heard that, I just fell off my chair. He did what? That had to be the only team that ever went to training camp with 2 number 1 overall pick rookie quarterbacks. Two first picks in the draft went to compete against each other as rookies in Thousand Oaks, California in training camp. I was there. I saw it. That team That first Jimmy Jerry team went 1-15 only because Steve Walsh, as the starting quarterback at Washington, beat a very good Washington team and Doug Williams to give them their one against the 15 losses. What? So fairly early the next season, they were getting offers for Steve Walsh, and they finally said, well, we can't walk away from this one. And Jimmy finally threw up his hands and said, okay, let's take a 1, 2, and a 3, first, second, and third round pick from New Orleans for Steve Walsh. It's a pretty good haul. But that following Sunday, when Troy Aikman finally had the team all to himself, no Steve Walsh looking over his shoulder pads, this was a game at the Jets. I was there. Troy Aikman was just awful, just dreadful, just painful to watch. And that Monday evening, the next evening, back at Cowboys headquarters, Jimmy, who obviously took losses psycho hard, he was still steaming over Troy's performance. And maybe after he'd had a couple of Heinekens, he told a group of reporters, and I quote, Troy Aikman was a loser in college, and he'll always be a loser in the pros. I'm going to say it again. Troy Aikman was a loser in college, and he'll always be a loser in the pros. What? That didn't make it into the documentary. But if you remember, at Oklahoma, Aikman had lost to Jimmy's Miami team in Norman. That was a game in which Troy's leg was broken by the late, great Jerome Brown. And then at UCLA, Troy lost twice to Rodney Peete and crosstown rival USC and didn't play all that well in either of those games. So it was the following Cowboys season, this is 1991, when Aikman sprained his knee at Washington. Steve Berline replaced him during that game through a late touchdown pass. They pulled off the big upset. And the Cowboys, as Berline took over, just took off. They won 5 in a row to end the regular season. They won a playoff game over Mike Ditka's Bears in Chicago. That was a Jim Harbaugh game. Jim started at quarterback. He did play quarterback at a high, made a Pro Bowl team. But Troy Aikman, I was right in the middle of this, made it clear that he was healthy and ready to go for the final regular season game and that playoff game at Chicago, and then obviously the next week's playoff game at Detroit. But nope, Jimmy stuck with the hot hand with Steve Berline, whom I saw the other night at the premiere for this Netflix doc. Enjoyed catching up with him. So at that point, Troy, in his third NFL season, was furious. And frankly, this is something that's plagued me, perplexed me. I never understood why Troy let Jimmy off the hook for that. That was a deal breaker, or should have been. And Troy let it go because I think he let Jimmy ultimately con him as they sort of fell in love with each other over their shared mutual love of watching tropical fish. Don't get me started. That's Jimmy, con artist, the highest order. So that next week at Detroit, the Cowboys did get blown out. Berline wasn't very good. They weren't very good. Nobody was any good. Troy's still furious. He had to mop up in that game, garbage time. So I did happen to be on that team plane on the flight back to Dallas that night from Detroit. I was sitting up at the front of coach, working on my, typing my column, surrounded by, 8 or 10 other media types. When all of a sudden, as we got up in the air, I heard a player's voice come over the PA system from the back of the plane saying, "Skip Bayless, please report to the back of the plane." Looked up, looked around. the other media people said, don't go. Because this, maybe they'd smuggled on a little something to drink or whatever to take. Not a safe place to be in the back of the plane right now. But you know me, I just said, no, I'm going to do this. If that's what they want to do, I'm game. And I got up and I marched all the way back to the back through all the players and coach. Some of them who looked at me with round eyes, because waiting for me in the back of the plane was Mark Tuinei, all 6'5", 320 pounds of Mark Tuinei. He was Troy Aikman's blindside bodyguard at left tackle. And Mark Tuinei ended up sort of pushing me up against the bathroom door in the back of the plane. I don't think anybody was in the bathroom at that time. But he started pushing me up against the door this way and grilling me about why I had so strongly supported Steve Berline publicly as the quarterback of the Cowboys over the last 7 weeks. And as he began to push me up against the door to make his point in his questions, I'm watching players gather behind him to watch this. And at the very back of this little semicircle of players was Troy Aikman, carefully watching what I was about to say. I never knew. Did Troy put Mark up to this? I have no idea. But he was watching, he was listening, as Mark kept asking me, why? Why did you support Steve Berline? Why did you campaign for whatever he's saying? Why did you defend him? Why? And I said, I kept telling Mark Tuinei, because your coach kept starting him. And after a while, I started to get madder and madder. And I said, Mark, why don't you just walk up to the front of the plane and ask your head coach why he kept starting Steve Berline over Troy when Troy was ready to go and healthy as ever, according to Troy. You go ask him. I mean, the players were all afraid of Mark Tuinei, but I'm pretty sure Mark Tuinei was afraid of Jimmy Johnson because they all were. So this began to escalate, and there was one moment when I thought, he just might hit me. And if he'd hit me, I'd have gone right through the bathroom door. But at that point of no return, that flashpoint moment, all of a sudden the players parted like the blue sea, and up stormed Jimmy Johnson, coming all the way from his seat at the very front of the plane. And he pointed at Mark Tuinei and he said, "You take your seat right now." Some other words thrown in. And then he turned to the rest of the players and he said, "All of you back in your seats right now." And then he turned to me, not to leave me out, and he said, "And you get back to your seat right now." And I happily and thankfully and gratefully went straight back to my seat. So it's possible that Jimmy Johnson saved my life that evening, the back of that team plane. But 2 years later, Jimmy might have wished he'd have let Mark Tuinei finish me off. I'll get to that in a moment. But think about how lucky Jimmy was about to get with his offensive coordinator. This turned everything around because when Jimmy first took over, he brought in David Shula, who was the son of the great Don Shula, to run the Cowboy offense. But Aikman began to clash with David Shula and vice versa. And I was actually with Troy on this one. I thought David was It's like I'm a Shula and you're not. And it's just a little hard to deal with, and it just didn't work with Troy. So nothing's working. Jimmy's not working with Troy, and David Shula's not working with Troy. So Jimmy did fire David Shula. Way to go. That was smart. He almost had to. And yet, as he tried to hire another coordinator, as I recall, Jimmy struck out on the first 7 names on his list, the first 7 candidates, all for various reasons. Jimmy failed to land. Number 8 on the list, as I recall, was the receivers coach for the LA Rams. Not the coordinator, the receivers coach for the Rams. The receivers coach was Norv Turner, who the first moment they met in Jimmy's office, they just hit it off. In part because they shared a love of country music, both big country music fans. And Norv instantly became the big brother Troy never had. Norv rebuilt Troy's confidence. Norv helped convince Troy that Jimmy did believe in him, which by 1992, which was the breakout season, the first Super Bowl season, Jimmy had realized he'd better figure out Troy or they weren't going to last as a team. They just weren't going anywhere without Troy becoming Troy. So Jimmy did, with Norv's help, eventually con Troy into believing that Jimmy did believe in him. That's Jimmy. I'm definitely not sure that Jimmy Johnson would have won any of his 3 Super Bowl rings without Norv Turner. Definitely believe that. Okay, so now to the recurring battle that you'll see in the Netflix doc over whether Jimmy or Jerry deserved the credit for the Herschel Walker trade that did, of course, provide the sort of foundational draft picks that allowed the Cowboys to draft Emmett and Russell Maryland and Darren Woodson and starting corner and Kevin Smith. Here's the truth. And I know this story. Neither Jimmy nor Jerry deserve much, if any, credit for trading Herschel Walker. So at this point, we're going back to 1989, Jerry for a while did have an assistant GM that he's never had since. That was my guy, John Wooten. John, of course, played for the Cleveland Browns. He was a Pro Bowl guard, opening holes if they needed to be open for the great Jim Brown. John went on from Dallas to be the GM of the Eagles and GM in Baltimore. And as I'm writing my book, God's Coach, and then into my next book, again, John was always very open and honest with me. So the story was that John was on the phone with Minnesota's assistant GM trying to work a trade for a linebacker named David Howard, who was eventually thrown into the deal. But that's all John was interested in was David Howard. And at that moment, Mike Lynn, who was the president of the Vikings, grabbed the phone out of the assistant GM's hand and said, "Hey, John," Mike Lynn. And the question was, what would it take for you guys to trade Herschel Walker? And John said, "Seriously?" Mike Lynn said, "I'm very serious about this." And John, just off the top of his head, said, "Well, we'd have to start with 3 first-round picks and 3 second-round picks." Mike Lynn said, "Okay, I'll go there." One thing led to another, and finally, John said, "Okay, if you're serious, could you please fax your offer to this number," which was Jimmy's fax. And it went from there. And by the way, that next weekend, is another time I flew on the team plane from Dallas to Green Bay. They were going to play Green Bay. Again, Cowboys were like an expansion team. They were so bad. But it was clear to me that Herschel had gone over the edge into the backside of his career. He just taken way too many hits, and they didn't need Herschel Walker. They needed to build. They needed draft picks. So it's pretty obvious to me that if somebody would give you a haul for Herschel, you got to do it. So as I was walking to the team plane out on the tarmac of this remote field with the remote parking, Jimmy was standing out on the tarmac below the stairs going up into the plane, and he waved me over and he asked me, what would you think if I traded Herschel Walker? And I told him, I said, I don't know what you're getting back, but if it's substantial, I'd be all for it. He wanted to know how I would handle it, as a newspaper columnist. Would I be pro or con? I'd be big pro, and I was. And I don't remember that many people being pro Herschel trade, which Jimmy in the press conference called the great train robbery, which it was. But and Jimmy, by the way, denies that story. I told it somewhere else, and he publicly denied that he asked me about that. But that's a lie. He did ask me about that day on that Saturday morning as we were preparing to fly to Green Bay for what was Herschel's going to be last game as a Dallas Cowboy. But here's the point. The truth is neither Jimmy nor Jerry deserve credit for the Herschel Walker trade. Mike Lynn deserves the blame for the trade. They were so very lucky that Mike Lynn was that stupid. Seriously. Same goes for Carmen Policy, who was the president of the 49ers at this point through the 90s. In San Francisco, Charles Haley, the great Charles Haley, the deeply flawed Charles Haley, had become way more trouble than he was worth. As Barry Switzer says in the documentary, Charles bipolar, had to take medicine. They had to make sure he took his medicine. Bill Romanowski says in this documentary that he looked back one day in a team meeting, Charles was masturbating in the team meeting. And we all heard the story about Charles, upset over his contract, actually dropped his drawers and defecated on the GM's floor in his office. And so I understood why he'd become way more trouble than he was worth, even though he was a great player. Now has 5 Super Bowl rings, is in the Hall of Fame where he belongs. But I understood why Eddie DeBartolo, the owner, Carmen Policy, the president, finally said, nope, got to move him. But why would they move him to the team on the verge in the NFC? A team that was going to come and haunt you with Charles Haley. Why would you do that? It's just crazy. On Monday Night Football the other night, Troy Aikman said, and I quote him, that there's no way, he said, that we win any of our 3 Super Bowls without Charles Haley. And that's the God's truth. I've said that from the start. There is no way. They did not have a pass rusher of any magnitude. Tony Tolbert was the other defensive end, but they didn't have that. In the documentary, you'll see, maybe you already have, Jerry Rice saying that trading Charles Haley was the worst move ever, especially to the Dallas Cowboys, because Charles came back to haunt them in that 1992 NFC championship game at Candlestick. Difference maker, game changer. So in my second book, my Cowboys book called The Boys, I did give Jerry credit for driving home the Charles Haley trade with Jerry's super salesmanship and enthusiasm. And Jimmy, of course, was initially afraid that Charles Haley would just be uncoachable. He'd heard all the stories. But Jerry said, no, got to go, got to do it, plunged ahead, drove home the deal with Carmen Policy for what became the missing piece to the Super Bowl puzzle. The biggest, most crucial piece of the puzzle was Charles Haley. Trust me, Charles Haley was far more of a consistent game wrecker than Micah Parsons has ever been, at least so far. Just unblockable. I would watch 94 and I'd say, they can't stop him. They double team him every snap. He would power through in ways Micah's not capable of. He'd spin with quickness. He played with crazy rage, just possessed. I don't know. I don't see that in Micah, not yet. So Jimmy hated my second book, just despised it, which came out in July. This would be about 5 months after that first big Super Bowl win over, you remember, Buffalo out here in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl. I'm in LA. But Jimmy hated my book in part because it was competing with his book called Turning the Thing Around. Mine was the truth. But Jimmy blasted my book, and he told a group of reporters the day it hit the bookstores that I was banned. Skip Bayless is banned from all team facilities. Banned from the Cowboys was I by Jimmy Johnson. July 1993. So I went to Cowboy camp that July at St. Edwards in Austin, Texas. I went sort of half expecting that security guards, first day I walked out to practice, would come and haul me off the practice field sideline, tell me I couldn't come on the St. Ed's campus premises. So I'm standing on the sideline, and instead of that happening, about 5 minutes after I arrived, no exaggeration, Jerry Jones spotted me and made a beeline all the way across the practice field, past Jimmy standing in the middle of the practice field, all the way over to me on the sideline, the opposite sideline. And Jerry Jones, with Jimmy looking on out of the side of his eye, Jerry Jones shook my hand and said exactly this: as long as I own this team, you will be welcome here. Said Jerry eye to eye with me. And of course, I responded, man, I appreciate that, Jerry. That moment, that very flashpoint moment was when I knew for sure that what I had predicted in my book, The Boys, was dead on correct. Jerry and Jimmy weren't going to last much longer.